Welcome into the 10 best traps in the most common chess opening, the Italian game. I'm Grandmaster Igor Smirnov and I'll show you some less known and highly effective stuff. Usually your opponent will either develop his knight or his bishop, but for the first trap it does not even matter. Let's say black goes bishop c5, you castle, and then black plays knight f6. So far it looks like a standard opening, but we disrupt it with this move pawn to d4, which is actually the highest win rate move for white in this position. It does confuse a lot of players, even grandmasters got trapped and crushed quickly. Now, spoiler, the correct move for black is bishop takes d4, but actually only a minority of your opponents, roughly 25%, will play that move. The majority captures with a pawn, which is wrong because it allows your pawn to be pushed forward and to attack this knight. Now, where can this knight go? It can go here because of your bishop. If it goes to e4, then that is actually a really dangerous square because after queen e2, black will realize that the knight has nowhere to go. Your pawn takes away these two squares, and your bishop with the knight take away the g5, and therefore the knight is trapped. That is also not a good idea. How about knight to g8? That looks like a safe square, but in fact this move is another losing error. That's how tricky this gambit is. You jump forward with the knight, hitting that square f7. And once the knight comes to h6, you play rook to e1, which is quite an interesting move. For now, you just defend the pawn, but you also prevent black from playing d6, because in that case you would capture and deliver this discovered check. That's why we're wanting the rook to be there. But of course, for black it seems like not a problem at all. What if black simply castles right here? Well, that is another blunder, but of course it's really hard to foresee what is going to happen right here. You're playing queen d3, threatening checkmate. Black blocks the diagonal, and you shift the queen to the king side, attacking the knight once again. The knight cannot move, as otherwise queen will take on h7 with a checkmate. Therefore, to guard the knight, black has to play king to g7. Temporarily, it looks like black is holding everything perfectly fine, until you play the next move, queen takes h6. What? Which counts as a complete shocker. You're giving up the queen, but what for? Then you play knight takes f7, and now your opponent thinks, oh, no problem, even though it's a fork, I can simply capture the knight. But then he realizes that, oh, wait a second, there is also this sudden check from your bishop, from its original square, which means that the king has to go back. Now black expects you to capture the queen, but you play another strong in-between move, bishop h6. The only square for the king to go to is king to g8. But now not only you capture a queen, but you also do that with a check from a bishop. Therefore, that pushes the king to move, and black loses even more material. Now, at the very least, black will be down a rook. Very often they capture a knight, which is another mistake. And now you're up a rook and a bishop in a totally winning position. Another tempting move for black is knight to g4, which potentially looks more aggressive, but you strike in the center, and that leads us right to the second trap. Bishop takes f7. Instead of recapturing the pawn on c3, you actually target his king right away, and once the bishop is captured, now knight to g5 delivers a check to the king, plus it opens up this discovered attack of black's knight. And once the king tries to hide here in the corner, your queen suddenly changes her mind on the go and goes queen d5, but it's all good in the end. If your opponent mouse slips a correct move, then trade this bishop and then pin the other knight with your bishop. Now you're threatening to go f4, which will make this whole construction very shaky. Your opponent will naturally try to get rid of the pin, but you insist on keeping the pin alive, and if he hopes to kick this bishop all the way back, then you suddenly break open the center with pawn to f4. This move comes as a complete shocker, and again, even grandmasters and masters will defeat you that way. Just so unexpected and powerful this combo is. Now, white is obviously ready to sacrifice the bishop temporarily, because after pawn takes e5, you totally overpower black with a ton of threats. And otherwise, if black tries to keep the position close by playing pawn takes f4, you sacrifice the rook, open up the position entirely, and now queen takes d4 leads to this unusual crisscross tactic. The knight is pinned all over the place. After bishop takes f6, also queen to e5 will be a problem for black. Let's say black tries to castle, but now bishop takes f6, hits the queen. The queen has to go, and now there is a really beautiful and elegant finish to this astonishing game. Bishop h8 fianchettos your queen with a checkmate. The next trap works against the classical Italian game, Giuoco piano. Here you start by playing c3, the classical move, but after knight f6, your opponent expects this move pawn to d4, which leads to a very complicated theory, but instead you castle. And this move is much trickier than it seems at first, because initially it looks like just a normal castling. But here's the thing, in most cases your opponents castle as well, they mimic your move, which is very wrong, and in most cases lead them to a very bad disaster very quickly. You play d4, hitting his pawn and bishop, and after an exchange in the middle of the board, basically you're winning the game right here. Because when your king was on e1, black could retreat the bishop on b4 with a tempo, but not any longer. Right now the bishop has to go somewhere back, but that doesn't even matter because you just start pushing your pawns forward, kicking all these knights back. The knight cannot go in the center because of your knight, therefore the knight has to go somewhere back. Now you keep pushing forward, and of course black can retreat the knights, but that allows you to march this pawn forward and to totally restrict black. Now just look at this. All these pieces cannot come out of the last rank. That is how powerful your pawn on d6 is. It just blockades everything. That's why your position is so strong. Now you throw the bishop out, hitting the queen. He can't move this pawn because it's pinned. Therefore, knight f6 is forced, and now you develop. Black is almost running out of moves as this knight is pinned, and otherwise the queen side is just locked with your powerful pawn on d6. Black is trying to at least get rid of the pawn of the bishop, but now you have another fantastic continuation, queen to d3, a fantastic move. You give up the bishop because of this pin. Now, since the pawn is still pinned, it cannot capture your queen, and otherwise you're threatening to take this pawn and then to double down on this pawn on f7. Knight h7 is what your pawn will likely play, trying to defend this pawn on g5, but now you play another great move, knight to d5. Bringing this knight into play, threatening check, but your opponent will notice that, hey, wait a second, this queen is no longer, defended, or rather I should say the pawn is no longer pinned, and therefore he can just go ahead and take it. Is it something that you blundered? Not really, because now you've got knight to e7, and that leads to an absolute nightmare for black. Now there's going to be the final trap for white, and after that we'll switch sides and see how you can trap white when you're playing black. Alright, anyway, I have to show you this very classical trap. The most classical trap of the Italian game, and nevertheless, up to this day, lots of players fall for it. So here you attack the bishop. Now, as we have seen before, black can't play passively. If the bishop retreats somewhere back, then your opponents keep rocking, chasing all these knights away, keep oppressing black, and you're just winning. Therefore, bishop b4 is pretty much forced for black so that they can gain some time. Now you cover your king, still you have the very same threat of moving your center forward, but now black can play knight takes e4, capitalizing on this pin and attacking the knight once again. However, you don't care, you just prioritize quick development and attack. His king is still in the middle of the board, and you want to make use of that. And from here, the correct move is bishop takes c3. It leads to a ton of theory. I've got a dedicated video about that. But the trap is after knight takes c3. Again, beginners usually fall for this idea because it looks tempting for black to win more material, attack your rook, and they hope that you will defend the rook somehow and black will castle. But instead of defending your rook, you give it up and play bishop to a3, cutting the black king off so that it can no longer castle. And now you threaten all sort of attacks right here, and if black bites the bullet, and I should say the rook, then you play rook to e1 check. Together with the dark square bishop, it attacks the black king very effectively, cannot run away, knight e7 is forced, but now you grab it. And now black is facing a sad choice, either to give up the queen, which will lead to a lost position anyway, the king will be exposed, and this bishop on a1 will fall as well, or to try to run away, which does not quite work, because now it leads to a very rare double checkmate. Now we're moving on to some really cool traps for black. Here you can play knight f6, and if your opponent goes for this attack of the f7 pawn, you continue with pawn to d5. Now after this exchange, beginners usually recapture, which leads to this knight takes f7 fried liver attack, where black gets in trouble real quick with this attack, but of course we do not want to go there. Instead, pros go knight a5, which is a very solid line, but you can go b5, a very unexpected move, but also very strong. I have another video where Carlsen used it successfully, and here b5 hits the bishop. Now, it's very complicated for white to figure out the right way. Here, if white captures on c6, then you recapture, and now this pawn actually restricts his development, plus this knight on g5 is misplaced, you're about to kick it back, and black usually gets a very good position right here. The correct move by white here is a very surprising move, bishop to f1. Kind of accepting that it was wrong to challenge you in chess and trying to restore it all back to its original position. But of course, most of your opponents will be more arrogant and will try to move on with bishop takes b5. Now you recapture this pawn with a queen with a double attack. It looks like it's very easy for white to get rid of this issue by just trading off on c6. But now you've got this really strong pressure to the pawn on g2, and on the next turn, due to the fact that you don't have this pawn on b7, you can fianchetto the bishop and form this battery. It threatens checkmating 1, therefore white tries to blockade the diagonal, but now you kick this knight away. Basically, as white's early attack failed, this knight on g5 is misplaced, and you are only gaining temples attacking it. Ideally, white would wish to retreat the knight to the middle of the board, but they can't because of your knight. Therefore, the knight is pushed all the way back to h3, and now you can be absolutely merciless and just go for it. You go g5, you want to play g4, attack the knight and this pawn, and then checkmate him. Moreover, even if white moves the knight back, you still go g4, capitalizing on the very same battery. White can't ever take it, because queen will take on g2 with a checkmate. But even if white plays any other move, you still open up the g-file, and even in even endgame, you are able to bring your rook into the attack and then finish the game with this bishop check, and actually a checkmate. But white was completely defenseless right here already. After the rook check, let's say if white tries to cover with the knight, there are many ways for you to win here. I like this one, bishop c5 check. The knight is still pinned, therefore the king has to go. Now knight takes g4, you capitalize on the pin and you grab the knight, and you never stop attacking. You're really playing in the best style of Tal or Morphy, going all out, just sacrificing everything, all forward for the checkmate. The next trap is extremely common, probably one of the most common opening traps of all. Once you attack the central pawn, it's very natural for white to wish to develop their knight and to defend the pawn, but it's actually wrong because it allows you to capture it with your knight, seizing the initiative. At first this looks like a blunder, but then you play pawn to d5, regaining a piece with a very nice initiative right here. Now the correct move for white here is bishop to d3, but only advanced players would play that, and even after that it's not easy for white to get out of this, while objectively speaking the position is equal. In the vast majority of the cases, however, they will realize that they're losing one of these pieces anyway, and will try to take this most straightforward approach to get at least a pawn for a bishop, but that is wrong, and after queen takes d5 you've got basically a positionally won game. You've got total control in the middle of the board, you've got two powerful bishops, you also control this file, and you're probably going to castle there. You're probably going to push this pawn forward to f5 and kick out this knight. You've got really all the positional advantages that you'd wish to have, and if it's not really clear how to convert that into a win, I've got a free masterclass about positional chess. It's probably one of the most important chess skills of all. I'll link it down below if you're curious. For now, just to show you one quick potential variation, if white decides to defend this knight this way, then you can continue developing a bishop. Also, this knight is now pinned, and after h3 trying to get rid of the pin, you can go knight to d4, and that totally overpowers white. This counterattacks the queen, white needs to do something about that, but on top of that you're also adding pressure to this knight on f3 and to this knight on e4. And if the queen moves somewhere here, then you can win with knight to c2. Of course white could play differently, but you have a very strong attack in all those cases. You can pull off the next trap when your opponent tries to use that fried liver attack on you. Here after d5 initially you block the diagonal for his bishop, and then you can jump with your knight forward. It looks easy for white to unblock his bishop's diagonal by going pawn to d6. Somehow my arrow is wrong, I meant this one. And now queen takes d6 looks losing for black at first due to knight takes f7, forking your queen and rook, and that is what white is generally speaking hoping for with this early knight attack. However, it is wrong because after queen to c6, you're able to turn the tables, and now actually white is crumbling. Here you're attacking the bishop, this pawn on g2. The bishop also cannot easily retreat because it needs to guard the knight on f7. Therefore white can just retreat somehow. And instead he'll play, okay, I'm gonna go ahead and capture this rook. But now you take the pawn on g2, threatening rook. And once the rook moves, you slide the queen back with a check. Notice that your knight controls this square, therefore white cannot cover with the queen. And if white covers with the bishop, that leads to this funny smothered checkmate. Another way to sacrifice your opponent's sanity is to capture this pawn in the middle of the board. Initially it looks crazy. Not only you do nothing to protect your f7 pawn, you also give up your knight. But somehow this move actually is a lot stronger than it seems. And by the way, even though Stockfish tells you that it's a bad move, I've checked it in the database, only 2% of white players know the refutation, meaning 98% will choose one of wrong moves where you've got great winning chances. First off, if white simply captures the knight, that leads to this d5 where you regain a piece with a nice initiative position, but instead most players will just stick to their plan and will play knight takes f7. This fork seems winning for white, but you go for your counter-attack, and this counter-attack is unexpectedly strong. You've got this knight and queen hitting this pawn on f2. If necessary, you can also add the bishop from c5. Plus, white can't ever use the queen to defend, because then knight to d4 will be very strong with all sorts of threats, and therefore somehow it's not easy for white to block this attack and all those other attacks which are coming. If white tries g3, kicking the queen out and hoping to win your rook after that, then you sacrifice the knight and win the game anyway. This way you're hitting the rook. Also, the pawn on h2 is pinned. If he captures your knight, you're going to capture the rook with a check. That is bad for white. Otherwise, if white captures with another pawn, then queen to e4 is another double attack, hitting the king and the rook. And if white wants to defend the rook that way, with a queen, then you throw the bishop out. We always have this additional attacking resource, pushing the king back to the first rank, and now you're able to grab the rook with a check, and then you keep attacking. There are many ways for you to win here. The easiest is just to grab the queen with a bunch of new checkmating threats. The next idea is even more than just a trap. It's an entire system, a plan that you can use throughout different lines of the Italian game. Here, pretty often your opponent will develop the bishop in a way where it pins your knight. And it's very important for you to not castle early, because we're going to start this pawn attack on the king side, and we're going to use his own bishop as an object that gives you those extra temples for your attack. Moreover, we're not going to stop even here. You keep pushing those pawns forward, and that somehow gives you super quick attack on the king side. Because notice that you've got this bishop pointing there, you've got the other bishop right there, your rook is getting active right from its original position, your both knights are ready to jump forward, and just with the sheer volume of arrows, you can see that your opponent is in trouble. Now, of course, there's one thing that we still need to be careful with. It's knight takes g5. This pawn is no longer defended, and therefore your opponent can go ahead and attack you. But you just ignore it, and you simply go into this all-out attack. The bishop is captured, therefore for white, there is also no way to retreat or defend, and they have to just go forward and try to counterattack. But you still ignore it and you sacrifice your queen. That was actually a really beautiful game that was played many years ago, but it's still one of the really great masterpieces of chess. Here Black gave up a queen and then brought the bishop forward. Black keeps putting more and more pieces into the attack. And now this pawn is very active, this bishop is very active, our rook is also attacking the king, and plus his queen is now hanging. White played queen to d2, and black played another great move. Instead of capturing the knight, black wastes no time and just goes forward. That creates a whole lot of threats, and white is defenseless. In the game, white captured this pawn, but that led to another beautiful combo, sacrifice of the knight, and now white is defenseless against the following checkmate. So far we talked about traps in the Italian game, but if you want to understand the strategy behind it, the right plan to follow in the Italian game, I've covered it in this video. Check it out right there, it's going to be very helpful. And if you want to improve your positional understanding overall, head to this free masterclass and I'll be happy to help. Talk soon.